The tube was still hot 12 hours after the last round left it. A 105mm M102 howitzer, serial number long since illegible under carbon scoring, sat in its pit at Fire Support Base Gold with the barrel depressed to 0 degrees elevation. Howitzers aren't supposed to do that. They're designed to lob shells in high arcs, killing things miles away that the crew will never see. This one had been aimed like a rifle, straight out across the perimeter wire, its muzzle pointed at a tree line 60 meters away. The trees themselves told part of the story. Thousands of steel flechettes, tiny darts, each about an inch long, shaped like finishing nails with fins, had embedded themselves in the trunks, the stumps, the dirt. They stuck out of sandbags in neat rows, as if someone had hammered them in by hand. Spent brass casings lay heaped around the gun's trails, in piles deep enough to twist an ankle. The gun's wheels had sunk into mud churned by the crew's boots during hours of sustained firing, and the recoil spade had carved a trench in the laterite. Blood, not all of it belonging to the enemy, had dried brown on the gun shield. If any of this is new to you, drop a comment with what brought you here. A like and a subscribe help this channel keep digging into battles that don't show up in the textbooks but deserve to. The date was June 27th, 1969. The place was Tay Ninh Province, deep in War Zone C, maybe 10 kilometers from the Cambodian border. FSB Gold was one of dozens of small fire support bases the U.S. Army had punched into the jungle during the summer campaigns, a rough circle of red dirt hacked out of triple canopy forest, ringed with concertina wire and claymore mines, home to elements of the 2nd Battalion, 14th Infantry, and their supporting artillery battery. The base existed for one reason: to provide fire support for infantry operations sweeping the border region. The guns were supposed to shoot outward, at targets called in by forward observers kilometers away. Nobody planned for the guns to shoot at what was standing right in front of them. But that's what happened. Sometime after 2 a.m., the North Vietnamese Army came through the wire. It wasn't a probe or a harassment action. It was a full regimental assault, hundreds of soldiers from the 95th C Regiment moving in waves across open ground that had been defoliated and cleared specifically to create kill zones. The NVA knew the kill zones were there. They came anyway, preceded by a mortar barrage that cratered the interior of the base and knocked out communications in the first minutes. The assault force hit from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated attack that showed weeks of reconnaissance and preparation. The NVA had watched the base, mapped its defenses, timed its routines, rehearsed the approach. The artillerymen of Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 32nd Artillery had trained for fire missions at 15 kilometers. They had not particularly trained for what amounted to point-blank combat against massed infantry. But the ammunition bunkers held something unusual. Beehive rounds, designated M546 for the 105, each shell packed with approximately 8,500 steel flechettes designed to turn a howitzer into the largest shotgun on the battlefield. The rounds had a variable time fuse that could be set to burst at specific distances or switch to direct action, meaning the shell would detonate on contact with anything solid. At 0 elevation, aimed straight into an oncoming human wave at ranges under 100 meters, a single beehive round would scythe a cone of flechettes across a front roughly 50 meters wide. The crew of that scorched howitzer fired those rounds as fast as they could load them. What happened over the next several hours would become one of the most intense direct-fire engagements by American artillery in the entire Vietnam War. The NVA kept coming, and the gun never moved, and the mathematics of 8,500 flechettes per shell multiplied by dozens of shells began to produce results that the after-action reports described in language that was clinical and bloodless and so completely inadequate it read like satire. War Zone C was the most dangerous real estate in South Vietnam, and the Americans knew it, and they built bases there anyway. The zone covered roughly 700 square miles of Tay Ninh Province, stretching from the provincial capital northwest to the Cambodian border and beyond. Triple canopy jungle so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Bamboo thickets dense enough to stop a man cold after 2 meters of hacking with a machete. The laterite soil turned to red soup in the monsoon and baked to concrete in the dry season. Rivers and streams braided through the terrain in patterns that changed with every wet season, making maps unreliable within months of being printed. The Viet Cong had owned this ground since the late 1950s. Underneath the canopy lay an infrastructure that American commanders spent years trying to comprehend. Base camps with hospitals, arms factories, training facilities, even printing presses churning out propaganda. Tunnel complexes connected fighting positions to supply caches. The headquarters of the Central Office for South Vietnam, COSVN, the Communist Command Authority for the entire Southern War, operated somewhere in this wilderness, moving every few weeks, never staying long enough to be targeted. American intelligence spent enormous resources trying to pin COSVN to a grid coordinate. The file on its location grew thick with contradictions. By 1969, the NVA had turned the border region into a revolving door. Regiments would stage in Cambodian sanctuaries, technically neutral territory that the U.S. could not legally strike with ground forces, then slip across the border along trails invisible from the air, attack, and withdraw before a reaction force could arrive. The 95th C Regiment, the unit that would hit FSB Gold, had been doing this for years. They'd appear on intelligence summaries, engage American units in sharp firefights, then dissolve back across the border like smoke through a screen door. American signals intelligence would track their radio traffic into Cambodia, and the tracking would stop at the border because the rules of engagement said it had to. This was maddening for the field commanders. The 25th Infantry Division, which owned the Tay Ninh area of operations, had fought some of the war's bloodiest engagements in War Zone C. The Battle of Suay Tre in 1967. The fighting around FSB Bert later that same year. Each time the pattern repeated, NVA forces attacked in strength, took casualties, broke contact, and reconstituted across the border. The Americans would claim a tactical victory based on body count, and 6 weeks later, the same regiment would be back at full strength with fresh replacements funneled down from the north. So what was the American answer to a problem that kept regenerating itself? Fire support bases. The concept was straightforward even if the execution was brutal. You carved a clearing out of the jungle, flew in artillery, ringed the position with wire and mines and infantry, and used the guns to support patrols pushing deeper into enemy territory. The base became bait and shield simultaneously. It projected firepower across kilometers of jungle while daring the NVA to attack a fortified position covered by interlocking fields of fire. If the enemy took the bait, so much the better. A massed assault against a prepared defense with artillery support was exactly the kind of fight American doctrine was built to win. The problem was that the NVA read doctrine too. They understood that a firebase was only as strong as its garrison, and garrisons in War Zone C were small by necessity. Helicopter resupply limited how many troops a base could sustain. A typical firebase might hold a company of infantry, maybe 150 men, plus an artillery battery of 6 guns with their crews. Against a full NVA regiment of perhaps 1,500 soldiers willing to absorb massive casualties to overrun the position, those numbers got uncomfortable fast. FSB Gold sat right in the middle of this calculus. A small base, deep in hostile territory, wholly dependent on helicopter resupply and air support that couldn't fly in bad weather or at night. The NVA had been watching it for weeks. They chose to attack in darkness, during weather that grounded most aviation assets, at the hour when human alertness drops to its lowest point and the perimeter guards are fighting their own eyelids. They had done their homework. The Americans were about to find out how well. Chainsaws hit hardwood at first light on March 19, 1969, and the sound carried for miles. Anyone within earshot knew exactly what it meant. The Americans were building again. Engineers from the 25th Infantry Division worked outward from the helicopter landing zone in expanding arcs, dropping trees with a systematic efficiency that would have impressed a logging crew. Triple canopy jungle doesn't fall easily. The upper layer alone rose over 100 feet, and beneath it, two more strata of growth interlocked so tightly that a felled tree often hung suspended in the arms of its neighbors, requiring cables and winches to drag it clear. The heat under that canopy was suffocating. 100 degrees with humidity so thick it felt like breathing through a wet towel. Men soaked through their fatigues in minutes and didn't dry out for days. The clearing they carved was roughly circular, maybe 200 meters across. Not large. Every meter of open ground represented hours of cutting, hauling, and burning. And the perimeter had to be defensible before nightfall, because the NVA monitored these construction projects the way a landlord watches an unwelcome tenant move in. Infantry from the 2nd Battalion, 14th Infantry fanned out to provide security while the engineers worked, setting up listening posts in the tree line and running patrols along likely avenues of approach. The jungle was quiet. Quiet meant nothing out here. By the afternoon of March 20th, the guns arrived. 6 M102 howitzers from Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 77th Artillery were slung in beneath CH-47 Chinooks, one at a time, each helicopter flaring hard over the fresh clearing and releasing its load onto ground still littered with sawdust and wood chips. The gun crews followed on smaller Hueys, jumping out with their kit before the skids fully touched down. Within hours, the howitzers were positioned in their pits near the center of the base. Trails spread, ammunition stacked in sandbagged bunkers dug into the laterite. Concertina wire went up in belts, 3 rows with tanglefoot strung low between the outer two. Claymore mines, their front-toward enemy embossed casings facing the tree line, were staked into the earth at intervals along the wire. Fields of fire were cleared, final protective fire coordinates registered. Bunkers reinforced with overhead cover made from logs and PSP. Pierced steel planking normally used for airfield surfaces. FSB Gold was open for business. The jungle watched it settle in. Specialist 4 James Riley was brushing his teeth when the first mortar round hit. The shell landed near the ammunition bunker on the east side of the perimeter, throwing a column of red dirt and shrapnel skyward at 6:30 a.m. on March 21st. Riley dropped the toothbrush. He never found it again, which is an irrelevant detail that he reportedly mentioned in every retelling for the rest of his tour. The second round landed closer. The third was close enough that the concussion knocked men off their feet and filled the air with a sound like a massive door slamming shut inside your chest. The mortar barrage lasted roughly 4 minutes. Between 40 and 60 rounds of 82mm mortar fire walked across FSB Gold in a pattern that was anything but random. The shells targeted the command bunker, the communications antenna, the ammunition storage points, the gun pits. Whoever was directing that fire had a map of the base layout accurate enough to put rounds on specific structures. The antenna went down in the first 90 seconds. The command bunker took a near-direct hit that caved in part of the overhead cover and wounded 2 men inside. Smoke and laterite dust turned the air orange-brown, thick enough that men 30 meters apart couldn't see each other. The Viet Cong, 272nd Regiment, had been sitting in the tree line since before dawn, waiting for their mortars to do the preparatory work. They believed FSB Gold was a soft target, an artillery position with minimal infantry protection, manned by cannoneers who knew how to serve as howitzers, but not how to fight as riflemen. The regiment's intelligence assessment, reconstructed later from captured documents, estimated the base held fewer than 200 defenders. The actual number was closer to 250, but the margin didn't concern the VC planners. They were bringing over 1,000 men, attacking from 3 directions simultaneously, and they expected to be inside the wire within 20 minutes of the first mortar round. The French had learned something about these kinds of calculations at a place called Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where artillery positions were overrun by infantry willing to absorb staggering losses to close the distance. The Vietnamese Communist forces had institutional memory of that victory baked into their officer corps. If massed infantry could overwhelm French artillery in fortified positions, a hastily constructed American firebase in the jungle should fold faster. The barrage lifted. For maybe 15 seconds, the base went silent. The silence was worse. Every man on the perimeter knew what it meant. Mortars stop when the assault force is close enough that continued fire risks hitting your own troops. 15 seconds of quiet meant the first wave was already moving. They came out of the jungle on the north, east, and south sides simultaneously. The vegetation had been cleared back from the wire, but not far enough. 60 meters in most places, 100 in a few. At a dead sprint, a man covers 60 meters in about 8 seconds. The lead elements of the assault force emerged from the tree line firing AK-47s from the hip, not aiming so much as creating a wall of noise and metal to keep the defenders' heads down while the sappers went to work on the wire. The sappers carried Bangalore torpedoes, lengths of pipe filled with explosive, shoved under the concertina wire and detonated to blast gaps in the barrier. Behind the sappers came the main assault groups, bunched tighter than any American infantry school would tolerate, moving fast. The sound hit the defenders before the visual picture fully registered. Hundreds of AKs firing simultaneously produce a roar that is physically disorienting, a crackling, overlapping wall of reports that makes it impossible to determine direction or distance. Mixed into it came the deeper thump of RPG-2s and RPG-7s, their rockets trailing white smoke as they streaked across the cleared ground and slammed into bunkers and sandbag walls. The base's own claymore mines began detonating, some command-fired by defenders who could see the wire, others triggered by tripwires that the sappers hadn't found. Each claymore sent 700 steel balls fanning outward in a 60-degree arc, and the effect on men caught in the open at close range was immediate. But the VC kept coming. The assault waves absorbed the claymore blasts and the initial rifle fire and pushed through the gaps the Bangalore torpedoes had blown. Within 5 minutes of the barrage lifting, enemy soldiers were inside the outer wire on 2 sides of the perimeter. The infantry fighting positions along the north and east were taking fire from front and flank simultaneously. Men were screaming for ammunition. The radios were down. Nobody could reach battalion headquarters to call for fire support or gunships. The artillerymen in their gun pits heard all of this. They could feel the small arms fire snapping overhead, feel the ground shake from RPG impacts, and they realized, nobody needed to say it, that the infantry couldn't hold the perimeter alone. The official designation was M546 Anti-Personnel Tracer, and the ammunition technical manual described its function in language so dry it could have been written about a kitchen appliance. The round contained approximately 8,500 steel flechettes, tiny darts, each about an inch long, weighing less than a gram, shaped like miniature arrows with stabilizing fins stamped into their tail ends. Packed nose to tail inside the shell casing, like sardines made of steel, they sat behind a small bursting charge designed to split the canister open at a preset distance from the muzzle. That preset distance mattered enormously. At standard settings, the round opened roughly 30 meters out, and the flechette cloud expanded in a cone that widened with distance. At 100 meters, the pattern covered an area roughly the size of a basketball court. At 50 meters, it was tighter, more concentrated. At 20 meters, the kind of range the gun crews at FSB Gold were about to deal with, the cone had barely begun to open. The density of steel hitting any given point in that compressed pattern was extraordinary. The M102 howitzer weighed about 3,300 pounds and was designed to lob shells in high arcs onto targets miles away. Depressing the barrel to zero elevation, pointing it flat straight ahead like a rifle, was technically possible, but doctrinally insane. The gun wasn't built for it. The recoil mechanism expected the barrel to be elevated, and firing at 0 degrees sent forces through the carriage in ways the engineers at Rock Island Arsenal had not enthusiastically endorsed. The gun crews did it anyway, because the alternative was dying. Sergeant First Class William Grubb, Battery A's senior non-commissioned officer on the gun line, gave the order to load Beehive. The crews had drilled this. Every firebase kept Beehive rounds stacked separately and marked, accessible in the dark by feel alone because everyone understood that if you needed them right now. A trained crew could load and fire an M102 in under 10 seconds. Under fire, with hands shaking from adrenaline and ears ringing from the mortar barrage, it took longer. Not much longer. The first Beehive round left the tube at a muzzle velocity of roughly 1,200 feet per second. 8,500 flechettes hit the assault wave on the north perimeter like a horizontal rainstorm made of needles. The effect on human bodies at that range was something the after-action reports addressed in clinical terms that did nothing to convey the reality. The front rank of the assault simply ceased to exist as a formation. 2,200. Battery A fired that many artillery rounds during the engagement, and the majority left the tubes in a window of roughly 3 hours. Do the math on 6 guns, and the number comes out to about 1 round every 30 seconds per howitzer, sustained, with crews hand-loading each shell under direct small arms fire. The VC assault didn't break after the first Beehive volley. It stalled, reformed in the tree line for maybe 2 minutes, and came again. The second wave stepped over the dead from the first and pushed toward the wire with a discipline that borders on incomprehensible to anyone who hasn't studied how thoroughly political officers could motivate men. Bangalore torpedoes blew fresh gaps. RPG teams targeted the gun pits directly now, recognizing that the howitzers had become the primary killing instruments on the base. 1 round struck the sandbag wall protecting Gun 3, collapsing part of the revetment and wounding 2 crew members with fragmentation. The crew kept firing. A loader on Gun 5 took shrapnel through his left forearm, wrapped it with a field dressing one-handed, and went back to feeding rounds into the breach. The after-action review noted his name was Specialist Rodriguez. His first name doesn't appear in the document. Along the perimeter, the infantry fight had become something medieval. On the east side, where the wire had been breached in multiple places, VC soldiers were inside the defensive positions, and the fighting was at distances measured in feet. Riflemen fired M16s into figures appearing out of the smoke at arm's length. Grenades, both American and Chinese manufactured stick grenades, flew back and forth across sandbag walls. 1 bunker changed hands twice in 15 minutes. The noise was beyond description, a physical weight pressing against the eardrums, and men later reported that they stopped hearing individual shots entirely. Everything merged into a single continuous roar punctuated by the much louder crack of howitzers firing Beehive from the center of the base. The gun crews alternated between Beehive and high explosive depending on where the threat was densest. Beehive for the massed rushes across open ground. High explosive with fuses set to burst on contact for the tree line, where follow-on forces staged between assaults. Sergeant First Class Grubb moved between the pits, coordinating fire, pointing at sectors, physically grabbing men, and redirecting them when a gun needed to shift. He was exposed above the sandbags for most of the engagement. How he wasn't hit is a question nobody in the battery could answer afterward. Somewhere around 8 a.m., 90 minutes into the fight, the radios came back up. A signals NCO had spliced the antenna cable with wire stripped from a Claymore detonator cord, which was resourceful in a way that probably violated about 4 technical manuals. The first transmission out was a request for immediate reinforcement and close air support. Battalion acknowledged. An armored relief column from the division's mechanized assets was already forming at FSB Diamond, roughly 12 kilometers to the southeast. 12 kilometers of single-lane jungle road against possible ambush. In M113, armored personnel carriers that topped out at maybe 40 miles per hour on a paved highway and considerably less on laterite mud. The defenders at Gold did the arithmetic without being told. Help was coming. It wasn't coming fast. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Grunwald reportedly told his driver one thing before the column rolled out of FSB Diamond: get there fast and don't stop for anything. The relief force was built around mechanized infantry from the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, riding M113 armored personnel carriers. The M113 was an aluminum box on tracks, 13 tons of vehicle that could stop small arms fire, but not much else. RPGs went through the hull like a fist through drywall. The men riding in the back knew this with the kind of intimate knowledge that doesn't come from training manuals. They rode anyway, standing in the cargo hatches behind their 50 caliber machine guns, scanning a tree line that could erupt at any second. 12 kilometers of road, the column covered it in roughly 40 minutes, which sounds slow until you account for the conditions. A single unpaved track cut through triple canopy jungle, muddy from recent rain, narrowing in places to barely wider than the vehicles themselves. The VC had used this road before for ambushes. Every culvert was a potential mine, every bend a kill zone waiting to close. Grunwald pushed through, without stopping to clear any of it, which was either reckless or exactly right, depending on whether the gamble paid off. It paid off. The column hit the southeastern tree line at FSB Gold around 9:15 a.m., and what the lead vehicles found was the rear of the VC assault force still oriented inward toward the firebase. The British Army has a phrase for this kind of tactical geometry. They call it being caught between hammer and anvil. The Zulus experienced it at Ulundi in 1879, though on a vastly different scale. The principle is identical. A force fixated on the enemy in front discovers a new enemy behind, and the mathematics of the situation collapse. The 50 caliber guns on the M113s opened up at ranges under 200 meters. Each gun fired at a cyclic rate of roughly 550 rounds per minute, and the column had over a dozen vehicles. Inside FSB Gold, the defenders heard the heavy machine guns and understood immediately what was happening. The gun crews kept firing Beehive into the north and east. The APCs chewed into the south and rear. The VC assault force, already bloodied, already stalled against defenses that were supposed to have crumbled 2 hours earlier, found itself being compressed from both directions. The withdrawal started in pieces. Small groups first, then larger formations peeling back into the jungle. By 9:45, the assault had disintegrated into scattered movement away from the firebase. The gun crews at FSB Gold were still firing when the first APC crashed through the wire on the southeast side, its driver apparently unclear on where the gate was. Nobody corrected him. The kill ratio at FSB Gold belongs in a category most military historians reserve for ambushes, not defensive stands. 647 VC dead were counted on the ground and in the tree lines within the immediate perimeter. 31 Americans killed. The ratio works out to roughly 21-1, which in a conventional engagement would suggest either a massacre of an unprepared force or a staggering mismatch in firepower. This was neither. The VC had initiated the fight on their terms, at a time and place of their choosing, against a firebase they had correctly identified as undermanned. They had achieved tactical surprise, knocked out communications, breached the wire in multiple locations, and penetrated the defensive perimeter. They did almost everything right. The Beehive rounds broke the equation. Sweep teams moved through the kill zones north and east of the perimeter, starting around 11 a.m., once the area had been secured and the last sporadic sniper fire suppressed. What they found was difficult to catalog using standard battle damage assessment procedures. The flechettes had done things to human remains that made identification of individual casualties nearly impossible in the densest impact areas. Medical officers accompanying the sweep noted that many bodies contained dozens of flechettes each, the tiny steel darts embedded so deeply that they weren't visible externally. In the areas closest to the gun pits, inside 40 meters, the concentration had been so extreme that the effect resembled something closer to industrial machinery than conventional weapons fire. An aside that goes nowhere useful but sits in the record anyway. One of the sweep team members recovered a single flechette that had passed entirely through a tree trunk, roughly 4 inches in diameter. The ballistics section kept it as a curiosity. It doesn't prove anything about the engagement that isn't already obvious from the casualty figures. The American wounded numbered 109, and the majority of those injuries came from the initial mortar barrage and the close quarters fighting on the east perimeter. The gun crews in the howitzer pits suffered surprisingly few casualties relative to their exposure, which the after-action review attributed partly to the sandbag revetments and partly to the fact that the VC assault waves never reached the center of the base in organized strength. They got close. Some of the flechette impacts on VC dead were measured at distances under 25 meters from the gun positions. At that range, the loader could have handed the round to the enemy personally. Captured documents recovered from dead officers in the following weeks told American intelligence what had gone wrong on the other side. The assault plan had allocated 45 minutes for the complete overrun of FSB Gold. The planning staff had assessed American artillery as a suppressive fire asset, something to be neutralized with the opening mortar barrage and then ignored. Nobody on the VC planning staff had accounted for direct fire Beehive at zero elevation because the tactic was so far outside normal artillery doctrine that it essentially didn't exist in their threat assessments. The phrase used in one captured document translated roughly as unexpected close-range fragmentation weapon. They didn't have a proper term for it. The French at Dien Bien Phu had used their artillery conventionally 15 years earlier, firing in high arcs at area targets, and the Viet Minh had defeated it by digging. That template, artillery as an indirect fire problem to be solved with entrenchment and counter-battery fire, was the institutional memory the VC brought to FSB Gold. The template was wrong. Sergeant First Class Grubb received the Silver Star. Specialist Rodriguez, the loader who wrapped his own shrapnel wound and kept feeding the breach, received the Bronze Star with Valor Device. The battery as a whole received a Valorous Unit Award. The citations used words like extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry. The Army always does. It means something simpler. These men refused to die, and because they refused, 647 others did instead. The Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Ground kept a Beehive round behind glass for decades, cut away in cross-sections so visitors could see the flechettes packed inside like steel sardines. The display card listed technical specifications: weight, muzzle velocity, dispersion pattern. It said nothing about what the round did at FSB Gold. It said nothing about the smell of cordite so thick it coated the back of men's throats for days afterward, or the way the ground in front of the gun pits looked when the smoke cleared, or the fact that some of the artillerymen who fired those rounds at zero elevation never talked about it again. The Beehive round didn't survive the war by much. By the mid-1970s, the M546 was being phased out of active inventory, replaced by improved conventional munitions, and eventually rendered diplomatically awkward by the 1980 Convention on certain conventional weapons, which restricted, though never explicitly banned, weapons designed to injure through fragments not detectable by X-ray. Steel flechettes show up on X-rays just fine, but the political climate had shifted. The Soviets pushed hard in international forums to classify flechette weapons alongside other so-called inhumane munitions, which carried a particular irony given that Soviet-manufactured 122mm rockets had been killing civilians across South Vietnam for years without generating comparable diplomatic energy. What FSB Gold actually proved had nothing to do with the flechette debate. It proved that American junior NCOs and company-grade officers could improvise under conditions that would have paralyzed a more rigid military structure. The VC operated on a plan. When the plan met an obstacle it hadn't anticipated, artillery used as a direct-fire shotgun at point-blank range. The assault continued along its original template because the command structure didn't permit the kind of real-time tactical adjustment that Grubb and his gun chiefs performed instinctively. The Israelis encountered the same phenomenon fighting Egyptian forces in the Sinai during 1967, where Egyptian units executed rehearsed battle plans with precision but collapsed when forced to deviate. Centralized command produces excellent set-piece attacks right up until the moment something unexpected happens. The declassified MACV assessment from late 1969 noted that direct-fire Beehive had been employed at least 11 times during the war, but FSB Gold represented the most sustained use under the most extreme conditions. The assessment recommended maintaining Beehive stocks at all fire support bases in Warzone C. Within 18 months, the firebase strategy itself was being dismantled as Vietnamization accelerated and American units withdrew. So, the weapon outlived its moment by almost nothing. The tactic outlived it by even less. What remains is specific and small. A cutaway shell in a museum that most people walk past. A Silver Star citation that describes 3 hours in language meant for official consumption. a Bronze Star with a V device awarded to a specialist whose first name the Army apparently didn't consider worth recording in the after-action review. And somewhere in the National Archives, a captured VC planning document that allocated 45 minutes to overrun a position its authors called a soft target. The artillerymen at FSB Gold were still alive at minute 46. By 10:30 a.m. on March 21, 1969, the firing had stopped and the dust was still settling over FSB Gold. Medics were already triaging the wounded in the gun pits, working fast, because some of the 31 dead had been alive 20 minutes earlier, and the line between categories was thin. Helicopter turbines spooled up at bases across Tay Ninh Province. The medevacs would fly for the rest of the day. The VC regiment that attacked FSB Gold had rehearsed the assault for weeks. They had built a sand table model of the firebase and timed their mortar preparation to suppress the guns while sappers cut the wire. They had allocated reserves for exploitation once the perimeter collapsed. By every doctrinal standard available to them, the plan was sound. The Viet Cong were not amateurs. They were experienced soldiers executing a well-conceived operation against a target their intelligence had correctly assessed as lightly defended. They chose wrong anyway, not because the plan failed on its own terms. The mortars landed where they were supposed to land. The sappers cut the wire on schedule. Assault waves crossed the open ground at the predicted intervals. Every mechanical element of the attack functioned. What the plan could not account for was an American sergeant standing in a howitzer pit deciding, on his own authority, in the middle of a firefight, with no precedent in his training manual, to depress his tube to 0 elevation and turn a field artillery piece into something that had no name. Grubb didn't ask permission. He didn't consult doctrine. The enemy was 40 meters away and closing, and he had 8,500 flechettes available per trigger pull, and that was the entire calculation. The VC lost somewhere north of 600 fighters in under 4 hours. American losses were 31 killed and 109 wounded. Most of those American dead have been lost to the compression that happens when a battle gets reduced to its statistics. The after-action review lists ranks and unit designations. A few first names survive in personal accounts published decades later. The majority exist only as numbers on a casualty report filed in 1969 and archived in a building most Americans don't know exists. Warzone C didn't get quieter after FSB Gold. The VC pulled back to refit, absorbed their losses into replacement drafts from the north, and within weeks were probing other fire bases along the Cambodian border. The American command rotated fresh units into the area. New fire bases went up. Others came down. The cycle continued with the grinding predictability that defined the war's middle years: build, defend, abandon, repeat. Battery A received replacement tubes for the howitzers that had fired over 2,000 rounds in a single morning. The bores were shot out, the rifling eroded to the point where accuracy at normal indirect fire ranges would have been unacceptable. At 0 elevation and 40 meters, accuracy hadn't mattered much. Grubb went back to work. Rodriguez went back to work. The gun crews cleaned their pits, restacked ammunition, replaced sandbags shredded by mortar fragments, and waited for the next fire mission. It came before sundown. A patrol from the 2nd Battalion, 22nd Infantry, had made contact 2 kilometers northwest, and FSB Gold's guns elevated to 30 degrees and began lobbing high-explosive rounds over the jungle canopy in the standard indirect fire role they'd been designed for. Somewhere in the pit, wedged between crates of high explosive and white phosphorus, sat a case of M546 Beehive rounds with 3 shells missing.